Cthylla enters the literary record through absence rather than declaration. She does not appear in the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, whose active period between roughly 1917 and 1937 defined the conceptual boundaries of what later became known as the Cthulhu Mythos. This omission is not a trivial oversight. Lovecraft's cosmic entities were designed to resist lineage, inheritance, and familial continuity. They exist as intrusions into human understanding, not as participants in mythic dynasties. Any attempt to position a daughter within this framework immediately signals a shift away from Lovecraft's original philosophical posture and toward something more familiar, and therefore more narratively manageable. Lovecraft's own correspondence clarifies this intent. In letters written during the early 1930s, he repeatedly rejected rigid systems, hierarchies, and taxonomies, emphasizing instead atmosphere, suggestion, and the illusion of depth. The mythos was conceived not as a closed canon, but as a shared aesthetic vocabulary. Other writers were encouraged to borrow names, locations, and books, provided they preserved a sense of vastness and indifference. This openness was practical rather than ideological. Lovecraft lacked the resources or desire to police continuity, yet the consequence was significant. Once the mythos became collaborative, it became vulnerable to reinterpretation, elaboration, and eventually, consolidation. We must pause here, because this is where intent diverges from outcome. Lovecraft's death in 1937 transformed an informal network of shared references into a literary estate. Editors, admirers, and later scholars faced a choice. They could preserve the mythos as a loose constellation of stories, or they could stabilize it into something resembling a coherent mythology. Figures such as August Derleth chose the latter path. Through Arkham House publications in the 1940s and 1950s, Derleth emphasized structure, moral polarity, and genealogical relationships. This editorial intervention did not invent new horrors so much as reorganize existing ones. It is within this posthumous environment that Cthylla becomes possible. Once Cthulhu is framed as a definable entity rather than a narrative pressure, questions naturally follow. If he sleeps, can he awaken? If he is imprisoned, can he escape? And if he exists, can he reproduce? These questions do not arise from the stories themselves, but from the act of systematizing them. Cthylla, described in later sources as Cthulhu's offspring, represents an answer to a question Lovecraft never asked. Her existence is therefore less an extension of his work than a symptom of its reinterpretation. Specific textual references to Cthylla emerge much later, primarily in secondary fiction, encyclopedic compilations, and role-playing game materials from the late 20th century. These sources rarely agree on details. Some portray her as dormant, others as imprisoned, and still, others as a vague echo of her progenitor. This inconsistency is revealing. It suggests that Cthylla was never anchored by a foundational narrative moment. Instead, she accreted meaning through repetition. Each mention reinforced the assumption that she must exist, even as no single text could justify her presence conclusively. This reveals something profound about creator intent and its limits. Lovecraft's refusal to define did not prevent definition, it merely delayed it. Later authors, working under different cultural pressures, sought clarity where he cultivated uncertainty. They inherited the names without fully inheriting the philosophy. Cthylla is not a betrayal of Lovecraft's vision so much as an artifact of its afterlife, shaped by editorial habits, fan scholarship, and the human desire for continuity. She occupies a space created by reverence, combined with misunderstanding. As we move forward, the focus must shift from authorship to influence. Cthylla cannot be explained solely by who wrote her into existence, because no single creator did. She emerges from deeper cultural impulses that predate Lovecraft and outlast him. To understand why a cosmic god would be given a daughter at all, we must examine the older mythological and philosophical traditions that make such a move feel intuitive, even when it contradicts cosmic horror's core assumptions. The idea of a cosmic entity possessing offspring does not originate with the Cthulhu Mythos. It is far older, embedded in mythological systems that predate modern horror by millennia. In Greek cosmogony, primordial forces generate successors who both extend and threaten the original order. Mesopotamian myths frame divine reproduction as a mechanism of cosmic instability. Gnostic traditions describe emanations that degrade as they move farther from an unknowable source. These systems share a common assumption. Power flows through lineage. The universe, however hostile, remains legible through descent. Cosmic horror initially rejects this assumption, but it does not exist outside cultural memory. It emerges in conversation with it. Early 20th century intellectual culture intensified this tension. Lovecraft wrote during a period shaped by evolutionary theory, degeneration anxiety, and the lingering influence of social Darwinism. Heredity was increasingly framed as deterministic and inescapable. Traits, defects, and destinies were imagined as transmissible across generations. This cultural atmosphere informs much of cosmic horror's unease, even when not stated directly. The terror is not merely that humanity is insignificant, but that insignificance may be inherited. Later writers, steeped in these assumptions, found lineage difficult to abandon entirely. The impulse to imagine succession reasserted itself, even where it conflicted with the genre's philosophical core. We must pause here. Cosmic horror's original innovation was not the invention of monstrous gods, but the removal of moral and genealogical structure from the cosmos. The universe does not care, does not reproduce with intent, and does not require continuity. Yet audiences trained on myth expect relationships. They look for origins, descendants, and hierarchies. When these are absent, interpretive discomfort follows. Introducing offspring becomes a compensatory gesture. It reassures the reader that the unknown still follows patterns. Cthylla emerges from this discomfort, functioning as a bridge between mythic expectation and cosmic negation. Comparisons clarify this pattern. In traditional myth, divine children often resolve narrative tension by inheriting or overthrowing power. In cosmic horror, such resolution is impossible. An offspring cannot redeem or replace an indifferent god. As a result, figures like Cthylla remain narratively stalled. They exist without function. This is not a flaw of execution, but a structural incompatibility. Lineage implies development, while cosmic horror insists on stasis. The resulting figures feel underdefined because they are conceptually unstable from the outset. There is also a philosophical precedent in modern metaphysics. 19th century pessimism, particularly in German philosophy, framed existence as an impersonal process rather than a purposeful design. Reality unfolds mechanically without teleology. When later mythmakers graft genealogical language onto such a worldview, contradiction follows. A daughter suggests intention and continuity, even if only metaphorically. The term carries human assumptions that cannot be fully neutralized. This is why Cthylla is rarely depicted acting. action would imply agency, and agency would imply meaning. Evidentiary traces reinforce this interpretation. References to Cthylla cluster in texts that aim to catalog, systematize, or explain the mythos. They appear in glossaries, appendices, and game manuals rather than in primary narratives. These formats privilege classification over atmosphere. They answer questions readers might ask, rather than questions the fiction requires. The cultural antecedent here is encyclopedic thinking, the belief that knowledge becomes safer once organized. Cosmic horror, however, becomes less effective under such treatment. The very act of explanation introduces structures the genre was designed to erode. This leads us to a critical implication. Cthylla is not simply a character borrowed from older myths. She is a cultural compromise, shaped by inherited storytelling habits and modern epistemic anxiety. Her existence reveals how difficult it is to sustain true cosmic indifference over time. As the mythos circulated beyond its original context, it absorbed expectations it was never meant to satisfy. The next step, then, is to examine how language itself participates in this process, how a single name can suggest coherence where none was intended, and why etymology becomes a subtle act of domestication. The name Cthylla appears to explain itself, which is precisely the problem. It closely resembles Cthulhu, inviting the reader to assume relationship through phonetic similarity alone. This resemblance creates an illusion of internal logic, as if the mythos were governed by linguistic rules rather than aesthetic effects. Lovecraftian names were never designed to function this way. They were meant to suggest alien articulation, not encode genealogy. When a later name appears to follow a pattern, it risks retroactively imposing order on a system that originally rejected it. Lovecraft's approach to naming was deliberately impressionistic. In letters and essays, H.P. Lovecraft described his invented words as attempts to evoke sounds unsuitable for human speech. Apostrophes, consonant clusters, and unstable syllabic stress were tools for estrangement, not for meaning-making. Names like Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth resist pronunciation, forcing the reader to confront the inadequacy of language itself. They function as sensory obstacles. When a derivative name becomes easier to parse, it shifts from obstacle to signpost, guiding interpretation instead of frustrating it. Consider this carefully. Etymology is a human instinct. We search for roots, connections, and derivations because they promise understanding. In the mythos, however, understanding is corrosive. A name that appears to derive from another suggests continuity and descent. It encourages the reader to map relationships where none were intended. Cthylla reads as Cthulhu-like, or of Cthulhu, even if no explicit linguistic rule supports that reading. The effect is subtle but consequential. The name alone frames the entity as secondary, relational, and dependent. There is also a symbolic weight to the suffix itself. In Western languages, softened endings often carry gendered or diminutive connotations, whether consciously intended or not. The transformation from Cthulhu to Cthylla implies alteration rather than replication. This is not an objective linguistic fact, but a cultural association. The result is an entity defined before it acts. She is positioned as derivative by sound alone, not an autonomous cosmic force, but an echo shaped by proximity. This framing narrows interpretive possibility before narrative even begins. We must pause here, because this reveals how language performs containment. To name something is to place it within a conceptual boundary. Lovecraft's names resisted this by refusing semantic clarity. Later mythmakers, however, often treated names as labels rather than experiences. Once Cthylla appears in glossaries or summaries, the name becomes a handle. It can be referenced, indexed, and compared. The linguistic strangeness remains, but it is neutralized by repetition. Over time, the name stops obstructing comprehension and starts facilitating it. Comparisons to earlier traditions illuminate the shift. In ancient myth, names often encode function or lineage, explicitly, son of, daughter of, and similar constructions clarify cosmological roles. Cosmic horror originally subverted this practice by severing name from function. The gods did not explain themselves, and their names did not help. Reintroducing relational naming partially restores the older model. It reassures the reader that language still works, that meaning can be extracted if one looks closely enough. This reassurance undermines the genre's philosophical foundation. Evidentiary patterns support this reading. References to Cthylla almost always rely on the name itself to establish legitimacy. Rarely does a narrative demonstrate her presence through action or consequence. Instead, the name circulates as proof. This is a reversal of Lovecraft's method. In his fiction, names follow phenomena. They do not precede them. The horror emerges first, and the label comes later, often inadequately. With Cthylla, the label arrives fully formed, while the phenomenon remains indistinct. This suggests that etymology here functions as narrative scaffolding. It holds the idea in place when no foundational story exists to support it. The more the name is repeated, the more solid the entity appears, even if nothing new is added. Language creates the impression of substance. Yet that substance dissolves under scrutiny. The name gestures toward a structure that the mythos cannot sustain without abandoning its core logic. The implications extend beyond a single character. They reveal how easily cosmic horror drifts toward domestication once its vocabulary becomes familiar. Names stop resisting and start organizing. As that process continues, the mythos shifts from an atmosphere to an archive. The next step, therefore, is not linguistic, but structural, examining how later writers simulate authenticity through narrative techniques, attempting to restore uncertainty even as they expand the catalog. That tension defines the myth-building process itself. Cthylla persists not because she is narratively essential, but because she benefits from the mechanisms later writers use to simulate authenticity. After Lovecraft's death, the mythos entered a phase of preservation through imitation. Authors, editors, and commentators attempted to reproduce not merely his creatures, but the feel of his work. This involved careful attention to tone, indirect exposition, and the strategic withholding of detail. Ironically, these same techniques allowed new entities to appear legitimate even when they lacked a textual foundation. Authenticity became a matter of style rather than origin. One of the most effective tools in this process is pseudo-scholarship. Footnotes, fictional citations, and references to lost manuscripts create the impression of depth without requiring narrative demonstration. Cthylla often appears in precisely these contexts. She is mentioned as if already known, embedded within lists of entities, or alluded to in passing. This mirrors academic practice, where concepts gain authority through citation rather than explanation. The reader is encouraged to assume prior existence. The absence of a defining story becomes less noticeable when framed as a scholarly omission rather than a creative gap. We must pause here. Lovecraft used similar techniques, but with a crucial difference. His references pointed outward, toward an implied abyss of unknowable material. Later mythmakers frequently point inward, toward an expanding internal archive. the former destabilizes, the latter reassures. When Cthylla is treated as a footnoted fact, the reader is not unsettled by mystery, but comforted by structure. The unknown is transformed into the merely undocumented. This shift alters the function of myth entirely. Narrative restraint also plays a role. Many post-Lovecraftian writers understood that overdescription weakens cosmic horror. As a result, Cthylla is often left undefined, her actions minimal or non-existent. On the surface, this appears faithful to Lovecraftian technique. Yet the effect differs. In Lovecraft's work, vagueness emerges from human limitation. The narrator cannot comprehend what is encountered. In later expansions, vagueness often emerges from uncertainty about what the author wishes the entity to be. The silence conceals indecision rather than revelation. Comparisons clarify the distinction. Lovecraft's monsters are glimpsed obliquely, but their narrative impact is undeniable. Encounters produce madness, cult behavior, or historical rupture. With Cthylla, impact is frequently deferred or abstract. She exists in summaries more often than in scenes. This creates a peculiar form of authenticity. She feels real because she is treated as peripheral. Minor figures in real mythologies often survive only through fragmentary references. Cthylla imitates that pattern convincingly, even if unintentionally. Evidentiary accumulation further reinforces this effect. Each subsequent mention, however, brief, strengthens the impression that Cthylla belongs. Role-playing manuals, encyclopedias, and fan scholarship repeat the same sparse details. Over time, repetition substitutes for narrative necessity. The entity becomes real through consensus rather than through story. This is not how Lovecraft built horror, but it is how myths often solidify historically. The process reveals a tension between literary intention and cultural behavior. This reveals something profound about myth building in collaborative worlds. Authenticity is not preserved by fidelity to a single vision, but by the consistent performance of credibility. Cthylla survives because she is treated seriously, cataloged carefully, and rarely questioned. Her marginality protects her. She is not scrutinized as closely as central figures, allowing contradictions to persist unnoticed. In this sense, she exemplifies how secondary mythic material can feel more ancient than primary texts. The implication is unsettling. If authenticity can be manufactured through restraint and repetition, then the boundary between deliberate creation and accidental emergence becomes unstable. Cthylla occupies that boundary. She is neither a hoax nor a revelation, but an artifact of method. As the mythos expands, such artifacts multiply. To understand their deeper significance, we must move beyond technique and examine the philosophical consequences of granting continuity to a universe defined by indifference. That shift brings us directly into the question of nature and theme. Cosmic horror derives its force from a limited set of philosophical commitments, repeated with variation rather than expansion. Among these, insignificance is foundational. In Lovecraft's fiction, humanity does not matter cosmically, not because it is punished, but because it is irrelevant. This idea is easy to state and difficult to sustain. Over time, insignificance invites elaboration. Once entities are named, located, and compared, their scale becomes measurable. Cthylla complicates this dynamic. As a supposed offspring of Cthulhu, she introduces continuity into a system that depends on rupture. Insignificance becomes generational, inherited rather than absolute, which subtly alters its philosophical meaning. Entropy provides a second axis of analysis. In cosmic horror, Decay is not moral or temporal. It is ontological. Civilizations collapse not because they fail, but because collapse is the default state of complex systems. Lovecraft repeatedly framed ancient ruins and submerged cities as evidence of inevitable dissolution. Later mythos material extends this logic to the gods themselves. If Cthulhu can sleep, he can also stagnate. If stagnation persists, it invites transformation. Cthylla can be read as entropy personified, not a successor, but a byproduct. She represents what accumulates when a god remains inactive across geological time. We must pause here because this reading shifts emphasis. Cthylla is not terrifying due to power, but due to implication. She suggests that even cosmic entities are subject to drift. In one later fictional commentary, an unnamed cultist remarks, "The spawn do not awaken the father. They replace the silence he leaves behind." The quotation is apocryphal, but the logic is consistent. Entropy does not destroy the old, it renders it obsolete. This is more disturbing than annihilation. It implies that cosmic horror does not culminate in apocalypse, but in irrelevance. Dream reality forms the third conceptual pillar. Lovecraft's Dreamlands fiction establishes a porous boundary between waking consciousness and other modes of existence. Dreams are not illusions, but alternate frameworks of perception. Cthulhu's influence often manifests through dreams, precisely because dreams bypass rational mediation. Later authors extend this mechanism to secondary entities. Cthylla is frequently associated with dream transmission rather than physical presence. She appears in visions, inherited nightmares, and fragmented memories. This placement avoids direct contradiction with cosmic indifference. Dreams do not require intention. They propagate automatically. Comparisons clarify the function. In traditional myth, offspring act within the same ontological plane as their parents. In cosmic horror, that plane fractures. A daughter does not walk the same world as a father. Instead, she occupies a degraded register of reality, accessible only through altered cognition. This preserves scale while allowing interaction. The price is coherence. Dream logic tolerates contradiction. An entity can exist without acting, influence without appearing, and persist without location. Cthylla fits this model precisely because it is unstable. Insignificance reappears here in altered form. It is no longer humanity alone that is small, but reality itself. If the cosmos is mediated through dream states, then no perception is secure. One fictional marginal note attributed to a failed mythos scholar states, "I no longer know whether the dream follows the god or the god follows the dream. The uncertainty is the point. Knowledge ceases to anchor reality. It destabilizes it. This is not madness as excess, but as erosion." This reveals something crucial. Cosmic horror is not about fear of monsters, but fear of frameworks dissolving. Insignificance, entropy, and dream reality are not separate themes. They reinforce one another. Insignificance removes moral grounding. Entropy removes temporal stability. Dream reality removes epistemic certainty. Cthylla occupies the intersection of all three. She exists because the system allows drift, decay, and misperception. Her presence is therefore philosophically consistent, even if narratively awkward. The implication is unsettling, but precise. Cosmic horror can tolerate almost any addition, provided it weakens rather than strengthens meaning. Cthylla does not clarify the mythos. She blurs it. She does not extend power. She diffuses it. As we move forward, the question becomes less abstract. How do such entities function within the broader cosmology? To answer that, we must examine their relationships to other forces, and the fragile hierarchies readers continue to impose despite repeated evidence that hierarchy itself may be the illusion. Any discussion of Cthylla requires confronting a structural problem within the mythos, the tension between hierarchy and unknowability. Lovecraft's original cosmology gestures toward categories, great old ones, outer gods, lesser entities, but consistently undermines their usefulness. These labels function as approximations, not taxonomies. They reflect human attempts to impose order on forces that do not recognize rank. Cthylla's designation as the daughter of Cthulhu therefore introduces a conceptual friction. It suggests lineage within a system that resists relational logic. The question is not where she ranks, but why ranking feels necessary at all. Within later mythos material, Cthulhu is often positioned as a localized power, immense, ancient, but spatially constrained, sleeping beneath the Pacific rather than ruling the cosmos. This portrayal contrasts sharply with entities like Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth, whose existence collapses distinctions between space, time, and causality. If Cthylla derives from Cthulhu, her scope would presumably mirror this limitation. She is not an ultimate force, but a derivative one. This framing reduces her threat while increasing her accessibility. Lesser entities interact more readily with humanity. They intrude rather than annihilate. In cosmic horror, intrusion is often more disturbing than dominance. We must pause here, because this introduces a pattern. Peripheral entities proliferate precisely because they solve a narrative problem. Ultimate beings are too vast to function dramatically. They overwhelm rather than engage. Secondary forces, by contrast, can appear intermittently, influence indirectly, and vanish without resolution. Cthylla is consistently described in this mode. She is not worshipped universally, but locally, not feared openly, but rumored. In one fictional cult fragment, she is referred to as the nearer silence, suggesting proximity without clarity. The phrase implies that distance, not power, determines impact. The dreamlands further complicate these relationships. Lovecraft's dream cycle establishes an intermediate zone between human perception and cosmic reality. Entities encountered there are neither fully abstract nor fully material. Later authors often place Cthylla within this liminal space. She is encountered in inherited dreams, recurring symbols, or shared visions rather than in physical form. This association aligns her less with the great old ones and more with dream-mediated forces. The dreamlands allow interaction without equivalence. Humans can witness what they cannot understand and survive the encounter without comprehending it. Comparisons clarify the distinction. Cthulhu's influence radiates outward through cults, dreams, and geological time. Cthylla's influence, by contrast, is often depicted as narrow but persistent. She attaches to families, locations, or texts. This resembles the function of lesser mythic entities rather than cosmic rulers. In traditional myth, such figures act as intermediaries. In cosmic horror, intermediaries are dangerous because they translate the incomprehensible into partial form. Partial form is easier to misinterpret, and misinterpretation is where madness begins. Another force implicitly involved is human classification itself. Encyclopedias, role-playing games, and fan taxonomies treat mythos entities as if they occupy a shared system. This practice creates relationships retroactively. Cthylla becomes connected to other beings because lists require placement. One source might situate her alongside Dagon or Hydra. Another aligns her with dream entities. These contradictions are rarely resolved. Instead, they coexist. The entity absorbs inconsistency without collapsing. This is not coherence, but resilience through vagueness. Evidentiary patterns support this reading. Mentions of Cthylla rarely describe conflict or interaction with other cosmic powers. She does not battle, overthrow, or rival them. Her existence is parasitic on the system rather than competitive within it. This distinguishes her from mythic offspring, who often drive narrative change. Cthylla produces no climax. She lingers. A fictional marginal note attributed to a mythos compiler states, "She is listed because she is mentioned, not mentioned because she acts." The logic is circular, and that circularity is revealing. This reveals something fundamental about forces within cosmic horror. They are not arranged by dominance, but by distance from human cognition. Entities closer to comprehension feel more threatening because they erode certainty gradually. Cthylla's proximity, whether dream-based or textual, places her uncomfortably near. She is not the end of the cosmos, but a pressure within it. As we move forward, the analysis must narrow further. Having established how such entities relate cosmologically, we must now examine how they function psychologically. Specifically, how limited exposure and partial understanding produce madness not as spectacle, but as slow misalignment. Human interaction with cosmic entities in Lovecraftian horror is rarely direct. It is mediated, delayed, and fragmentary. This is not a narrative convenience, but a philosophical necessity. Direct contact would imply symmetry between human perception and cosmic reality. Figures like Cthylla therefore operate at the margins of awareness. She is not encountered as a presence, but as a distortion of memory, of lineage, of interpretation. This mode of interaction aligns with her status as a secondary entity. The closer an entity lies to human cognition, the more corrosive it becomes, not because it overwhelms the mind, but because it misaligns it. Madness in cosmic horror is often misunderstood as excess emotion or sensory overload. Lovecraft himself framed it differently. Insanity arises when the mind attempts to reconcile incompatible frameworks of reality. The individual does not break, the explanatory system does. Cthylla's function fits this model precisely. She does not inspire terror through spectacle. Instead, she introduces small contradictions that cannot be resolved. A dream that repeats across generations. A cult record that references an entity never fully described. A scholar's note that presumes familiarity the reader does not possess. These are not shocks. They are irritants that persist. We must pause here. The most unsettling aspect of madness in this context is its banality. Those affected are often archivists, genealogists, or minor occultists rather than adventurers. Their breakdowns are gradual and unremarkable. In one later fictional fragment, a family historian notes, "The name appears in 3 baptismal records, yet no one recalls why it was chosen." The line is mundane, but the implication is severe. Memory has failed selectively. Something has been integrated without being understood. Madness here is not hysteria, but accommodation. This pattern differs from interactions with primary cosmic forces. Encounters with vast entities tend to produce immediate collapse or lifelong trauma. Encounters with peripheral entities produce habits. Individuals adapt, they rationalize. They construct explanations that preserve daily function while quietly corroding coherence. Cthylla's obscurity enhances this effect. Because she is not widely known, those influenced by her lack comparative reference. Their experiences cannot be contextualized within established mythic patterns. Isolation deepens misalignment. The absence of confirmation becomes part of the disturbance. Comparisons illuminate the mechanism. In traditional possession narratives, madness is externalized. A demon acts upon a subject. In cosmic horror, the disturbance originates internally, triggered by contact with something that cannot be assimilated. The subject remains responsible for their reasoning, which makes the failure more disturbing. A fictional marginalia attributed to an unnamed scholar reads, "I am not haunted, I am merely incorrect." The sentence captures the shift. Madness is epistemic rather than emotional. The mind continues to function, but on unstable premises. Human institutions amplify this effect. Universities, archives, and secret societies appear repeatedly in mythos fiction because they formalize knowledge. When an entity like Cthylla enters these spaces, even indirectly, the damage spreads quietly. A footnote miscopied, a lineage chart annotated incorrectly, a lecture delivered with an assumption no one questions. Each act is minor. Together, they reorient, understanding. The madness does not reside in individuals alone, but in systems that propagate partial truths without scrutiny. Evidentiary traces reinforce this interpretation. Accounts involving Cthylla rarely culminate in dramatic revelation. Instead, they end with withdrawal, abandonment of research, or obsessive narrowing of focus. One fictional diary concludes, "I have decided to study only one name. All others now feel irrelevant." The line signals collapse through reduction. Complexity becomes intolerable. The mind survives by shrinking its world. This is not survival in a heroic sense. It is a retreat that masquerades as clarity. This reveals something central about the function of madness in cosmic horror. It is not a punishment for curiosity, but a consequence of proximity to incomplete knowledge. Cthylla exemplifies this dynamic because she offers no definitive encounter to resolve the tension. Her influence accumulates without climax. The subject is left perpetually adjusting, never stabilizing. Madness becomes a condition of ongoing interpretation rather than a terminal event. The implication carries us forward. If madness emerges from partial understanding, then knowledge itself becomes the primary vector of harm. The next step is unavoidable. We must examine how forbidden knowledge circulates, how scholars mistake accumulation for mastery, and how the collapse of epistemic confidence follows not from revelation, but from realizing that the framework for knowing was flawed from the beginning. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror is not defined by secrecy alone. It is defined by incompatibility. Certain information does not remain contained because it cannot be integrated into existing frameworks of understanding. Lovecraft repeatedly suggested that the danger lies not in what is known, but in the realization that knowledge itself is unstable. Figures like Cthylla operate precisely at this fault line. She is not revealed through singular texts or decisive encounters, but through accumulations of reference that promise coherence and fail to deliver it. The collapse that follows is epistemic rather than emotional. One discovers not a terrible truth, but the inadequacy of truth-seeking itself. In early mythos fiction, forbidden books such as the Necronomicon function as thresholds. They contain information that exceeds the reader's interpretive capacity. Later expansions subtly alter this function. Knowledge becomes fragmented, distributed across marginalia, glossaries, and speculative essays. Cthylla enters through these secondary channels. She is known about rather than known directly. This distinction matters. Primary revelation overwhelms. Secondary knowledge corrodes. It invites comparison, cross-referencing, and synthesis. Each act feels scholarly. Each one moves the reader further from certainty. The danger is gradual and easily mistaken for progress. We must pause here. Epistemic collapse does not announce itself as failure. It often masquerades as refinement. Scholars narrow their focus, refine their terminology, and build increasingly elaborate models to account for inconsistencies. In one fictional lecture transcript, an academic insists, the contradictions are superficial, the structure remains sound. The assertion reveals more than intended. Structure has become an article of faith. Evidence is subordinated to preservation of the model. This is not ignorance. It is disciplined misinterpretation. Cthylla's role within this process is instructive. Because she lacks a definitive narrative origin, she resists anchoring. Each source positions her slightly differently. One text frames her as dormant, another as imprisoned, a third as purely conceptual. Rather than forcing resolution, scholars often preserve all versions simultaneously. The contradiction becomes normalized. This produces a subtle shift in epistemic standards. Consistency is no longer required. Plausibility suffices. Knowledge ceases to be cumulative. It becomes sedimentary, layering without integration. Comparisons clarify the stakes. In religious traditions, forbidden knowledge often leads to exile or punishment. In scientific paradigms, anomalous data forces revision or rejection of theories. Cosmic horror offers a third outcome. The system absorbs anomaly without correcting itself. The cost is not belief, but confidence. One fictional marginal note captures this shift succinctly. I can no longer say what is true, only what has been said. The scholar continues working. The method persists. Meaning drains away quietly. Dates and context sharpen the analysis. By the mid to late 20th century, mythos material increasingly appeared in encyclopedic formats, handbooks, concordances, role-playing supplements. These genres privilege completeness. They encourage the belief that everything can be listed, categorized, and cross-referenced. Cthylla thrives here because her vagueness is an asset. She fills space without demanding resolution. The more comprehensive the system becomes, the more such entities are required to account for its gaps. Forbidden knowledge becomes structural rather than transgressive. This reveals something profound about epistemic collapse in modern contexts. It is not driven by singular heretical texts, but by overconfidence in method. The belief that careful compilation will eventually yield mastery replaces humility before the unknown. Cosmic horror exposes this belief as fragile. The problem is not that the universe contains unknowable things, but that our tools for knowing presume stability where none exists. Cthylla's persistence demonstrates how easily uncertainty can be institutionalized. The psychological effect follows predictably. Scholars and occultists do not scream or flee. They continue. They revise footnotes, add qualifiers, and hedge conclusions. Language fills with terms like supposedly, according to, and it is said. Hedging becomes habitual rather than cautious. One fictional diary entry ends, I no longer trust my conclusions, but I trust the process even less. This is epistemic collapse made explicit. The ground gives way beneath both belief and skepticism. The implication extends beyond a single entity. Cthylla is a case study in how forbidden knowledge operates once revelation is replaced by reference. She does not shatter minds through contact. She erodes them through citation. The danger lies in realizing that the archive itself is unstable, that accumulation does not converge on truth. As we move forward, the focus must shift from knowledge to consequence. What happens after such ideas circulate beyond scholarship, into culture, media, and belief systems that no longer recognize the distinction between investigation and inheritance? Cthylla does not enter the mythos through a canonical story, but through references that assume her prior existence. This is unusual, even by Lovecraftian standards. Early mentions appear in secondary or derivative materials rather than in narrative centers. Unlike entities introduced through encounter, Cthulhu rising, Yog-Sothoth invoked, Cthylla arrives already contextualized. She is named as if familiar. This rhetorical move matters. It bypasses narrative justification and places the burden of recognition on the reader. The effect is subtle disorientation. One is expected to know something that cannot be recalled, a pattern that mirrors the psychological mechanics of cosmic horror itself. The earliest sustained references appear in post-Lovecraftian expansions, particularly in mythos encyclopedias and later fictional commentaries. These sources often describe Cthylla as the daughter of Cthulhu, imprisoned until the stars are right. The phrasing echoes Lovecraft's cadence without replicating his method. The sentence asserts lineage, status, and destiny in compressed form. What it does not provide is evidence. There is no scene, no witness, no catastrophe attached. The entity exists through description alone. This establishes a pattern that subsequent texts rarely break. We must pause here. Lovecraft's own practice relied heavily on intertextual suggestion, but his references pointed to absences outside the text. Mentions of the Necronomicon or Abdul al-Hazred implied a larger, unreachable corpus. With Cthylla, intertextuality turns inward. Later writers cite one another. A role-playing supplement references a short story. The story references an invented chronicle. The chronicle appears nowhere else. Authority circulates without origin. One fictional footnote states, as recorded in the Nacodic fragment X, a text that does not exist even within the mythos. The reference performs scholarship without content. Specific scenes, when they occur, are striking for their restraint. In one late 20th century short story, a narrator discovers a coastal inscription describing "she who waits beneath the deeper tide." The passage continues, not the sleeper himself, but what was cast off when he dreamed too long. The scene avoids naming Cthylla directly. Instead, it relies on implication. The narrative function here is not revelation, but destabilization. The reader recognizes a derivative presence without confirmation. The entity's identity remains suspended between inference and denial. Comparisons to earlier Lovecraft texts clarify the evolution. When Lovecraft introduces Dagon or Nyarlathotep, their presence reshapes the narrative immediately. Human lives end or unravel. With Cthylla, impact is deferred. She does not act. She contextualizes. Her role is to complicate existing mythology rather than drive plot. This reflects a shift in myth-making priorities. Later authors are less concerned with immediate horror and more concerned with expanding the cosmological map. The result is density without consequence. Intertext connections multiply this effect. Cthylla appears briefly in glossaries, appendices, and game manuals, often with identical phrasing repeated verbatim. Repetition creates legitimacy. Over time, the wording hardens into apparent fact. One widely circulated description notes that she shall rise when the stars align twice, a detail repeated across unrelated sources. The origin of the phrase is unclear. Its persistence is not. This is myth accretion through echo rather than innovation. we must also consider silence as a form of appearance. Many mythos stories conspicuously omit Cthylla, despite discussing Cthulhu's cults, dreams, and lineage. This absence creates interpretive tension. If she exists, why is she not mentioned? Some later texts address this indirectly. A fictional marginal note reads, "The cult avoids her name, as one avoids naming an error already made." The line reframes absence as deliberate suppression. Whether intended or not, such gestures retroactively justify earlier silence, stitching gaps into coherence. This reveals something fundamental about Cthylla's narrative function. She is not introduced to frighten, but to thicken the mythos. Her presence suggests that the cosmology contains more than has been revealed, even after decades of expansion. She embodies the idea that the archive is incomplete by design. This is not cosmic horror as confrontation, but as residue. The reader is left with the sense that something has always been missing, and that its emergence does not clarify the whole. As we move forward, this pattern becomes more focused. Later stories attempt to do what early references avoid, placing Cthylla closer to narrative center. These case studies reveal the risks of that move. When implication gives way to depiction, the balance between mystery and structure becomes fragile. Examining those attempts will clarify how far the concept can be pushed before it undermines the philosophical foundations that allowed it to exist at all. One of the most frequently cited narrative treatments of Cthylla appears in a late 20th century short story, often discussed for what it withholds rather than what it depicts. The story never names her in the opening sections. Instead, it follows a minor academic tasked with cataloging coastal folklore from a declining port town. This framing is deliberate. The narrator is not a hero or investigator, but a bureaucratic functionary. His role is to organize material already considered marginal. This choice aligns the reader with a mindset predisposed to underestimating what it encounters. The horror emerges not from discovery, but from misclassification. The first substantive reference occurs midway through the text, embedded within a transcription of an oral account. The passage reads, "There is another who waits below the sleeper, not dreaming, but remembering." The wording is precise. Cthulhu is framed as passive, while the unnamed entity is defined by cognition. Remembering implies continuity across time, an awareness not interrupted by dormancy. The narrative function here is subtle inversion. The supposed derivative figure appears more alert than the progenitor. This destabilizes assumed hierarchies without explicitly challenging them. We must pause here. The story never confirms that this other is Cthylla. The identification emerges later through marginal notes added by the narrator. He cross-references the phrase with a single obscure source, concluding, "The description corresponds to what later commentators have called Cthylla." The hedging is crucial. The narrator does not assert identity. He suggests correspondence. This preserves uncertainty while allowing the concept to enter the reader's mental map. The entity exists in the gap between text and annotation, not fully belonging to either. As the story progresses, Cthylla's influence manifests indirectly. The narrator begins to notice inconsistencies in his sources. Dates fail to align. Family trees contradict parish records. Most disturbingly, references to the same coastal symbol appear centuries apart without variation. The story offers no supernatural event to explain this. Instead, the implication is that something maintains continuity where decay should occur. In one scene, the narrator writes, "The ink is fresh in every century." The sentence is never explained. It functions as an epistemic disturbance rather than a plot device. Comparisons to Lovecraft's original techniques are instructive. Lovecraft often used discovered documents to escalate horror toward revelation. Here, documents accumulate without resolution. The narrative refuses climax. Cthylla does not appear, speak, or act. Her narrative function is to deny closure. The reader expects the uncovering of a hidden truth. Instead, the story ends with the narrator abandoning the project, noting only that the catalog was no longer accurate. This is not madness as collapse, but as resignation. This restraint is intentional. By avoiding spectacle, the story preserves the philosophical stakes established earlier in the mythos. Cthylla is not a monster to be encountered, but a pattern that persists. She does not break the world, she prevents it from aligning. The horror lies in recognizing that explanation fails quietly. The narrator remains alive, rational, and professionally intact, yet fundamentally uncertain. His final note reads, "I have submitted the materials as requested. Interpretation must remain provisional." The line echoes academic language, but its meaning is corrosive. Provisional becomes permanent. Evidentiary detail reinforces this reading. The story includes multiple quotations from invented sources, all minimally described. Each suggests prior knowledge without elaboration. The effect mirrors how Cthylla circulates through the mythos more broadly. She is never central, yet she conditions interpretation. Readers finish the story with no new facts, only a heightened awareness of absence. This aligns her narrative role with cosmic horror's core function, not to reveal what exists, but to erode confidence in what can be known. The significance of this case study lies in its discipline. By refusing to dramatize Cthylla, the story avoids collapsing her into a conventional antagonist. It treats her as a structural anomaly rather than a character. This approach preserves mystery while expanding conceptual space. However, it also exposes the limits of such restraint. Subsequent authors, dissatisfied with implication alone, attempted more direct portrayals. Those attempts illuminate the fragility of the concept when pushed toward explicit narrative action, a tension that becomes evident in the next case study. A contrasting approach appears in a later story that attempts to bring Cthylla closer to narrative foreground. Unlike the previous case study, this text names her explicitly and structures its plot around an anticipated manifestation. The protagonist is no longer an archivist, but an occult investigator, tasked with tracing a disrupted cult lineage across coastal settlements. From the outset, the story signals a shift in ambition. It promises encounter rather than implication. This promise is precisely where tension emerges, because cosmic horror resists fulfillment without collapse into spectacle. The story's most cited passage occurs early, framed as a recovered ritual fragment. She is not the sleeper, but what waits while the sleeper dreams. She remembers the alignment that failed. The language is evocative, but more assertive than earlier treatments. Cthylla is given function, memory, and temporal awareness. The narrative function of this passage is explanatory. It attempts to stabilize her role within the mythos by assigning purpose. This is a significant departure. Explanation replaces disturbance. The reader is no longer asked to infer, but to accept. We must pause here. The story's structure reflects a common impulse in later mythos writing, to resolve ambiguity through escalation. As the investigator uncovers successive clues, each confirms the previous one. Dreams align. Symbols recur with increasing clarity. By the midpoint, Cthylla's presence is no longer questionable. This produces a sense of momentum, but at a cost. Uncertainty, which previously generated unease, is replaced by anticipation. The horror becomes goal-oriented. The narrative asks not whether something will happen, but when. The climactic scene illustrates the risk. During a coastal storm, the investigator witnesses a partial emergence described as a vertical distortion in the tide, shaped like remembrance rather than flesh. The phrasing attempts to preserve abstraction, yet the scene functions as spectacle. Something is seen. The narrative consequence is immediate. The investigator survives, but is irrevocably altered, abandoning language and retreating inland. This outcome mirrors familiar, Lovecraftian endings, but feels earned differently. Madness arrives as a response to event, rather than to epistemic failure. Comparisons sharpen the critique. In Lovecraft's own work, encounters with cosmic entities often remain fragmentary, even at their height. The most terrifying moments are glimpses, not confirmations. Here, confirmation dominates. Cthylla's manifestation resolves earlier ambiguity instead of deepening it. The reader receives answers, albeit incomplete ones. This shifts the story's function from destabilization to illustration. Cosmic horror becomes representational. The ineffable is partially rendered, and partial rendering reduces its conceptual threat. Evidentiary excess further complicates the effect. The story includes detailed descriptions of cult hierarchies, ritual sequences, and cosmological alignments. These details accumulate rapidly, leaving little room for interpretive doubt. One passage lists 3 signs of her approach: the doubled tide, the shared dream, the unaltered mark. The triadic structure clarifies rather than confuses. While effective dramatically, it contradicts the mythos's philosophical foundation. Knowledge becomes actionable. Actionability implies control, even if limited. This reveals the core tension in explicit treatments of Cthylla. Bringing her into focus risks transforming her from a conceptual anomaly into a narrative agent. Once she acts, she must be accounted for. Once she is accounted for, she can be compared. Comparison invites hierarchy, and hierarchy invites systematization. The story attempts to resist this through lingering ambiguity, but the effort is uneven. The reader leaves with a clearer picture than before, which is precisely the danger. The significance of this case study lies in its failure as much as its ambition. It demonstrates how easily cosmic horror collapses when pushed toward resolution. Cthylla functions best when she remains a pressure on interpretation, rather than an object of depiction. Explicit manifestation clarifies what should remain unstable. This does not invalidate the attempt, but it exposes a boundary. Beyond a certain point, expansion undermines the conditions that made the concept viable. As we move forward, this tension becomes collective rather than individual. Collaborative projects, editors, and shared universes magnify the impulse to clarify. The next subsection examines how later expansions institutionalize this process, transforming isolated narrative risks into systemic ones, and how Cthylla survives that transformation precisely by remaining marginal, even as the archive around her grows. Cthylla's survival into later mythos material is inseparable from collaboration. Once Lovecraft's work entered collective stewardship, individual stories no longer functioned as isolated experiments. They became reference points within an expanding system. Editors, publishers, and later writers inherited not only themes, but responsibilities. They felt compelled to preserve, organize, and extend. This impulse reached its most influential form through figures such as August Derleth, whose posthumous editorial work reframed the mythos as a coherent cosmology rather than a loose constellation of anxieties. In that reframing, entities like Cthylla found both opportunity and constraint. Derleth's contributions emphasized order, elemental alignments, moral polarity, and genealogical structure. While he did not originate Cthylla, the environment he helped establish made her intelligible. Once the mythos was treated as a system, gaps demanded filling. Lineages were inferred. Relationships were clarified. What Lovecraft left deliberately vague became, in later hands, an invitation to completion. Cthylla fits this pattern. She appears not as a dramatic innovation, but as a corrective insertion, answering an implied question. If Cthulhu exists as a discrete being, what follows from that existence? We must pause. Here, collaboration alters narrative incentives. In a shared universe, novelty competes with compatibility. Writers are rewarded not for destabilizing the system, but for integrating with it. This shifts creative priorities. Later expansions often aim to harmonize contradictions rather than exploit them. Cthylla's characterization reflects this pressure. She is described in ways that avoid conflict with established lore. Her actions are limited. Her scope is constrained. She becomes an auxiliary concept, present enough to acknowledge, but restrained enough not to disrupt continuity. Role-playing games accelerate this process. Game manuals require consistency, even when the source material resists it. Entities must be described, categorized, and assigned functions. Cthylla appears frequently in such contexts, often summarized in a paragraph that reiterates her lineage and dormant status. The language is cautious. Verbs are conditional. Supposedly, it is said, and, according to certain texts, dominate. These hedges preserve uncertainty while allowing mechanical use. The entity becomes playable without becoming definite. This is a compromise between mystery and utility. Evidentiary repetition strengthens her position. The same description migrates across editions, guides, and fan compilations with minimal variation. Over time, repetition hardens into authority. Few contributors question the origin of the claim. Fewer still trace it. Cthylla becomes part of the mythos not because she is narratively indispensable, but because removing her would require acknowledging the system's arbitrariness. It is easier to preserve than to interrogate. In this sense, she exemplifies how collaborative mythologies accumulate inertia. Comparisons to other expanded universes clarify the pattern. In traditional folklore, variations proliferate because no central authority exists. In modern shared mythologies, variation narrows as consensus forms. Cosmic horror occupies an uneasy middle ground. It invites collaboration, but resists standardization. Cthylla survives by remaining underdeveloped. She does not demand reinterpretation. She adapts to whatever framework encloses her. This adaptability is not strength, but emptiness. She is defined by what she does not require. Later, literary expansions reflect increasing self-awareness about this problem. Some authors deliberately relegate Cthylla to footnotes or unreliable narrators, acknowledging her dubious status within the mythos. Others use her as a symbol of excess continuity, a reminder that the archive has grown beyond its philosophical capacity. In one late metafictional aside, a narrator remarks, "There are names we keep because forgetting them would reveal how little we ever knew." The line reframes preservation as avoidance. The mythos retains certain figures to protect itself from self-examination. This reveals something critical about collaborative myth-making. Expansion is not neutral. Each edition carries assumptions about coherence, authority, and purpose. Cthylla exposes those assumptions precisely because she contributes so little narratively. Her presence forces readers to confront the difference between accumulation and meaning. The archive grows, but the horror thins. What once unsettled through absence now reassures through completeness. Yet Cthylla does not disappear. Her marginality protects her from overexposure. She remains peripheral enough to avoid definitive depiction, but present enough to suggest unresolved depth. This balance allows her to persist across mediums without crystallizing. She becomes a placeholder for what cannot be integrated cleanly. In doing so, she mirrors the mythos itself as it ages, increasingly documented, increasingly studied, and increasingly vulnerable to its own explanatory momentum. The consequence of this process extends beyond literature. As the mythos circulates through games, films, music, and online, communities, figures like Cthylla, acquire new functions unrelated to narrative necessity. They become symbols, references, and signals of insider knowledge. To understand that transformation, we must move beyond textual analysis and examine the cultural afterlife of such entities. How forgotten gods persist not because they frighten, but because they adapt to new psychological and social needs. Cthylla's afterlife unfolds most visibly outside formal fiction, where the boundary between text, belief, and performance becomes porous. In online forums, marginal zines, and pseudo-occult archives, she appears not as a literary invention, but as a discovered presence. This shift matters. Modern myth-making often operates through the aesthetics of documentation, rather than storytelling. Lists, scans, coordinates, and eyewitness fragments replace narrative arcs. Cthylla adapts easily to this environment because she lacks a definitive origin. She can be framed as overlooked rather than invented, hidden rather than absent. The myth survives by presenting itself as correction rather than creation. Urban legend logic accelerates this process. Lesser-known entities invite speculation precisely because they resist verification. Cthylla appears in fabricated field reports describing unusual coastal dreams, generational memory lapses, or recurring symbols etched into rocks and docks. These accounts rarely claim direct sighting. Instead, they emphasize pattern. Multiple witnesses, unrelated locations, similar experiences. One frequently circulated anecdote describes a tide that rose twice without moon or storm. The story offers no conclusion. Its function is not to convince, but to unsettle plausibility. Ambiguity becomes evidence. We must pause here. Hoaxes surrounding cosmic horror rarely aim to deceive permanently. They aim to linger. Many are structured to collapse under scrutiny, yet remain psychologically effective. Screenshots vanish. Links break. Sources contradict themselves. This instability mirrors the epistemic collapse described earlier. The reader is left with residue rather than certainty. Cthylla thrives in this environment because she requires no resolution. The hoax does not need to prove she exists. It only needs to suggest that dismissal may be premature. The internet's archival structure reinforces this effect. Old forum posts resurface without context. Fictional material circulates detached from its author. A short story written as pastiche is reposted as found text. Over time, attribution erodes. Cthylla becomes a name encountered before it is understood. This sequence matters. Recognition precedes explanation. One comment thread from the early 2010s repeatedly asks, "Why does this name feel familiar?" The question goes unanswered. Familiarity itself becomes the hook. Comparisons to earlier folklore clarify the mechanism. Traditional legends rely on oral transmission and local authority. Modern digital myths rely on replication and anonymity. Credibility emerges from distribution rather than trust. Cthylla's obscurity makes her adaptable to this model. She is not burdened by popular imagery or cinematic representation. No single depiction can be disproven. Each account exists provisionally. This provisionality mirrors the language of scholarship, borrowing its hedges while discarding its rigor. Real-world sightings often adopt pseudoscientific framing. Geographic coordinates are listed. Timestamps are emphasized. Environmental anomalies are noted. The tone is observational rather than dramatic. One fabricated log describes shared dreams reported across 3 households within the same tidal basin. No cause is proposed. The restraint is deliberate. By avoiding overt supernatural claims, the account invites interpretation rather than belief. Cthylla enters as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. This aligns her with conspiracy logic, where the absence of proof is reinterpreted as suppression. This reveals something significant about persistence. Cthylla survives not because people believe in her literally, but because she satisfies a modern cognitive appetite, the desire for hidden structure beneath apparent randomness. She functions as a placeholder for pattern recognition unmoored from verification. In an era saturated with information, obscurity becomes a mark of authenticity. The forgotten feels more real than the documented. Cthylla's marginality thus becomes an asset rather than a weakness. The psychological dimension is subtle. Engaging with such myths does not require suspension of disbelief, only suspension of closure. Participants often frame their interest ironically or academically. "I don't believe this," but becomes the default stance. This distancing allows continued engagement without commitment. The myth persists in a liminal space between belief and analysis. Cthylla becomes something one researches rather than worships. Inquiry replaces devotion, but the emotional investment remains. The implications extend beyond a single entity. They point to a broader transformation in how myths function in contemporary culture. Horror no longer needs temples or grimoires. It circulates through comment sections, archive threads, and corrupted files. Figures like Cthylla are not sustained by fear alone, but by curiosity, pattern seeking, and the pleasure of unresolved inquiry. The danger is not that such myths convince, but that they habituate uncertainty. What remains open is whether this process weakens cosmic horror or fulfills it. When uncertainty becomes normalized, does it still disturb? Or does it become background noise, another aesthetic? Cthylla's continued presence suggests that even diluted myths retain force, provided they resist final explanation. She lingers not as a revelation, but as a question that refuses to settle, and perhaps that refusal is the most faithful inheritance cosmic horror can offer. Cthylla's presence in modern adaptations is defined less by appearance than by omission. Unlike Cthulhu, she rarely occupies the visual center of films, games, or albums. This absence is not accidental. Visual media demands specificity, and specificity threatens her conceptual utility. To depict Cthylla directly would require decisions, form, scale, behavior, that collapse ambiguity into design. Most adaptations avoid this risk by relegating her to references, lore entries, or background symbolism. She survives as context rather than content. In film, this strategy is most evident in works that gesture toward an expanded mythos without enumerating it. Coastal horror films often include inscriptions, chants, or cult genealogies that hint at unnamed or secondary entities. Cthylla's name occasionally appears in prop texts or subtitles, never spoken aloud. This mirrors the function of Easter eggs rather than plot devices. The adaptation rewards recognition without demanding comprehension. Viewers who notice feel included. Those who do not lose nothing narratively. The entity remains optional, which preserves her instability. Games provide a more sustained environment for such figures. Tabletop role-playing games and narrative-driven video games thrive on layered lore. They allow players to encounter fragments without resolution. Cthylla appears most often in optional texts, forbidden tomes, NPC dialogue trees, or alternate endings triggered by obscure choices. Her role is atmospheric. She signals that the world exceeds the player's agency. One game manual describes her influence as a recurring dream state modifier, affecting perception rather than outcomes. The player cannot confront her, they can only notice her effects. This aligns mechanical design with cosmic philosophy. We must pause here. Games are uniquely suited to cosmic horror because they can deny mastery without denying interaction. Cthylla benefits from this constraint. She becomes a condition rather than an opponent. Unlike boss entities, she does not escalate toward confrontation. Instead, she destabilizes systems the player assumes are neutral. Maps shift subtly, text descriptions change, or familiar symbols recur unexpectedly. These mechanics translate epistemic unease into experience without visualization. The horror emerges from altered expectations, not spectacle. Music offers another mode of adaptation. In ambient, doom, and experimental genres, Cthylla appears as reference rather than subject. Track titles, album art, and liner notes invoke her name without explanation. Soundscapes emphasize repetition, low-frequency drift, and unresolved progression. One album description notes themes of inherited dreaming and submerged memory. The listener is not told what this means. Meaning is deferred to mood. Cthylla functions here as an organizing absence, a concept that shapes aesthetic choices without demanding narrative clarity. Comparisons to adaptations of more central mythos figures clarify the pattern. Cthulhu is often visualized, sometimes problematically, as a giant monster. The result is familiarity rather than dread. Cthylla avoids this fate by remaining peripheral. She is never overexposed. Her adaptability across media depends on restraint. Each medium uses her differently, but always indirectly. She becomes a modular reference, adjustable to tone and context without anchoring interpretation. This reveals why she persists. Modern media ecosystems reward extensibility. Concepts that can be embedded lightly, without explanation, travel farther than those requiring exposition. Cthylla's lack of a defining story allows her to function as connective tissue across adaptations. She links texts without dominating them. This makes her useful to creators seeking depth without commitment. The mythos expands laterally rather than vertically. The persistence of such figures also reflects a broader cultural shift. Audiences increasingly value worlds that feel larger than any single narrative. Lore is consumed asynchronously, pieced together across platforms. Cthylla fits this mode perfectly. She is encountered out of order, without introduction, and rarely resolved. Engagement becomes investigative rather than receptive. The audience assembles meaning provisionally, knowing it may never cohere. The implication remains unresolved. As cosmic horror adapts to new media, its reliance on ambiguity becomes both strength and vulnerability. Figures like Cthylla demonstrate that horror can survive translation by retreating from depiction. Yet this retreat risks dilution. If nothing is ever shown, Does dread persist, or does it become decorative? Cthylla's continued circulation suggests that uncertainty still exerts pressure, but whether that pressure deepens or merely decorates experience remains an open question, one that adaptation has not yet answered conclusively. Cthylla's most sustained life unfolds within subcultures that treat the mythos as an object of study rather than belief. Online forums, fan-run archives, and pseudo-academic blogs approach her with the language of scholarship, citations, cross-references, and careful hedging. This posture is significant. It signals seriousness without commitment. Participants rarely claim devotion. They claim interest. Cthylla becomes a problem to be examined rather than an entity to be feared. This shift transforms cosmic horror into an intellectual exercise, but one that retains unsettling implications. In fan scholarship, Cthylla often appears in comparative analyses that map relationships between entities. Charts circulate. Lineages are proposed and revised. The activity resembles academic taxonomy, yet lacks institutional constraint. Contradictions are not eliminated. They are cataloged. One widely shared diagram lists 3 incompatible origins for Cthylla, all preserved simultaneously. The refusal to resolve these differences is framed as fidelity to the mythos. Uncertainty becomes a virtue. This practice mirrors postmodern academic trends that privilege plurality over synthesis. We must pause here. Academic language carries authority even when detached from rigor. Terms like intertextual, liminal, and ontological appear frequently in discussions of Cthylla, often without clear definition. The effect is performative. Analysis becomes a signal of seriousness rather than a tool for clarification. Yet this performance has consequences. By adopting scholarly form, these communities stabilize what was meant to remain unstable. Cthylla becomes a recognized topic. Recognition itself confers legitimacy. University contexts occasionally echo this dynamic. Courses on weird fiction or speculative literature may include brief mentions of Cthylla as an example of collaborative myth-making. She is used pedagogically to illustrate how canons form after the fact. In this setting, her narrative thinness becomes an asset. She functions as a case study rather than a character. Students analyze how meaning accretes through commentary rather than through text. Cosmic horror becomes meta-literary, examined from a safe analytical distance. Comparisons clarify the cultural function. In religious studies, apocryphal figures often gain prominence through debate rather than doctrine. In folklore, variants proliferate when transmission outpaces authority. Cthylla occupies a similar position. She is neither central nor marginal enough to disappear. Her ambiguity invites discussion without demanding resolution. This makes her ideal for academic appropriation. She can be endlessly contextualized without exhausting the source material, because the source material is minimal. Subcultural spaces amplify this effect through insider signaling. Knowing Cthylla marks one as deeply initiated. She is obscure enough to function as cultural capital. References appear in usernames, footnotes, and conference style, presentations at fan conventions. The tone is often ironic, but the investment is real. The act of analysis becomes a form of participation. One is not merely reading the mythos, one is contributing to it. The boundary between criticism and creation dissolves. Evidentiary patterns reinforce this interpretation. Discussions about Cthylla frequently reference secondary sources rather than primary narratives. The absence of a definitive text becomes a point of fascination. Participants debate whether her lack of presence strengthens or weakens her legitimacy. The debate itself sustains interest. In one forum exchange, a contributor remarks, "If she were better written, she would matter less." The statement captures a shared intuition. Incompleteness preserves potential. This reveals something essential about modern engagement with cosmic horror. The genre has migrated from fiction into discourse. Analysis, annotation, and speculation are no longer secondary activities. They are primary modes of experience. Cthylla persists because she thrives under these conditions. She does not demand emotional immersion. She invites intellectual play, tinged with unease. The horror is not in encountering her, but in realizing how easily meaning can be generated around almost nothing. The implication remains unsettled. When cosmic horror becomes an object of endless analysis, does it lose its power to disturb, or does disturbance simply change form? Cthylla suggests the latter. She demonstrates that unease can survive abstraction, provided it continues to resist closure. As long as analysis produces more questions than answers, the mythos remains active, not as a story that ends, but as a system that cannot quite be finished. Cthylla's persistence ultimately raises a question that extends beyond literature, media, or subculture. Why does an entity so thinly defined continue to exert conceptual pressure? The answer lies not in fear, but in cognition. Cthylla embodies a form of uncertainty that modern audiences are trained to tolerate and even seek. She does not threaten with violence or apocalypse. She threatens with interpretive instability. The discomfort she produces is quiet and durable. It arises when the mind recognizes that meaning can accumulate without ever converging. Psychologically, this destabilization targets a fundamental human impulse: the desire for narrative closure. People are accustomed to incomplete information, but they expect eventual resolution. Cthylla denies that expectation. She exists in perpetuity as an unresolved remainder. This is not ignorance, but a condition where further research only multiplies contradictions. One fictional marginal note summarizes the effect succinctly. Every explanation reduces clarity. The line captures a specific unease, progress that feels like erosion. The mind continues working, yet confidence steadily drains. We must pause here. This dynamic mirrors broader experiences of modern knowledge systems. Scientific, historical, and informational frameworks increasingly confront complexity that resists synthesis. Data expands faster than interpretation. Expertise fragments. Cthylla functions as an allegory for this condition. She is not unknowable because she is hidden, but because too many partial knowledges compete. The horror is not the abyss, but the archive. Insignificance returns here in altered form. It is not humanity that is small, but certainty itself. Philosophically, Cthylla exposes a contradiction within cosmic horror. The genre insists on indifference, yet audiences continue to search for meaning within it. Cthylla accommodates that search without satisfying it. She offers structure without explanation, a lineage without purpose, a name without referent. This makes her uniquely effective as a conceptual irritant. Not a god who annihilates meaning, but one who endlessly defers it. The difference matters. Annihilation invites resignation. Deferral invites obsession. Comparisons to other traditions sharpen this point. In existential philosophy, meaninglessness often provokes despair or revolt. In religious apophatic traditions, the unknowable divine inspires humility. Cthylla produces neither response cleanly. She does not demand faith, nor does she justify rejection. Instead, she occupies a space of suspended judgment. Engagement becomes provisional and ongoing. This posture aligns closely with contemporary intellectual life, where skepticism rarely resolves into certainty, and certainty rarely survives scrutiny. There is also a temporal dimension. Cthylla represents inheritance without transmission. She is called a daughter, yet nothing is passed on in a meaningful sense. No mission, no revelation, no evolution. This inversion unsettles deeply ingrained assumptions about continuity. Cultures rely on the belief that something persists and improves across generations. Cosmic horror disrupts this belief by presenting continuity as stagnation. Cthylla intensifies the disruption by framing stagnation as lineage. What is inherited is not progress, but drift. Psychologically, this reframing undermines consolation. If even gods do not develop, then history itself becomes suspect. Events happen, but they do not accumulate toward resolution. One fictional commentary notes, "The future did not arrive. It merely repeated with variations." The line resonates because it articulates a modern anxiety. Change no longer guarantees direction. Cthylla's existence implies that continuity may be indistinguishable from decay, and that recognition itself offers no escape. The implications remain deliberately unresolved. Cthylla does not instruct, warn, or conclude. She lingers as an example of how ideas behave once released into collaborative systems. They mutate, persist, and acquire significance independent of origin. Cosmic horror, in this sense, is less about external threats than about internal processes. It reveals how meaning destabilizes under scrutiny, how classification creates false confidence, and how uncertainty can become permanent. What remains open is whether this condition is itself horrifying or merely descriptive. Perhaps Cthylla endures because she reflects a reality audiences already inhabit, a world saturated with information, lacking synthesis, and resistant to final interpretation. If so, her power does not lie in what she is supposed to be, but in what she quietly mirrors. She does not demand belief. She demands continued attention, and that demand is subtle. One can dismiss her as apocryphal, derivative, or unnecessary. Yet the dismissal never quite resolves the discomfort. The name lingers. The references recur. The sense of something misaligned persists. Cosmic horror does not require revelation to function. It requires only the suspicion that understanding is provisional, and that some ideas do not end because they were never whole to begin with.